The boy from Halicarnassus. Long before history was written as we know it, before dates were fixed and empires neatly summarized, there existed a world held together by stories. Stories passed from traveler to traveler, from priest to king, from father to son. In that ancient world, memory was fragile, truth was debated, and the past could vanish as easily as smoke in the wind. It was into this world that a boy was born who would one day refuse to let those stories disappear. His name was Herodotus. Herodotus was born in the early 5th century BC, in the coastal Greek city of Halicarnassus, a place where worlds collided. Though Greek in language and culture, Halicarnassus stood under the shadow of the vast Persian Empire. Persian officials walked its streets, Greek merchants filled its harbors, and sailors from distant lands carried rumors of kingdoms beyond the horizon. From a young age, Herodotus listened. He listened to fishermen speaking of strange coasts across the sea. He listened to soldiers returning from wars they barely understood. He listened to elders argue about gods, kings, and the rise and fall of cities long gone. Unlike other boys, who dreamed of becoming warriors or politicians, Herodotus was drawn to something far rarer in the ancient world: curiosity. Why did empires rise? Why did kings fall? Why did men betray one another? And why, even in the midst of war and cruelty, did love and loyalty survive? These questions followed him as he grew older. Halicarnassus itself was ruled by Queen Artemisia, a fierce and intelligent leader allied with Persia. The city was not free in the way Athens claimed to be, and political tensions were constant. Herodotus grew up witnessing power at close range, how rulers justified their authority, how fear kept people silent, and how rebellion was whispered about but rarely spoken aloud. At some point in his early life, Herodotus and his family were forced into exile due to political unrest. This moment would change everything. Uprooted from his homeland, Herodotus learned the feeling of displacement, the sense of being a stranger. It would later allow him to understand foreign peoples not as enemies, but as human beings shaped by their own histories. As a young man, Herodotus began to travel. Not as a conqueror, not as a merchant, but as a listener. His journey would last nearly 8 years, carrying him across the known world. He walked roads used by kings and caravans, crossed deserts where stories were more valuable than gold, and sailed rivers that ancient civilizations believed were created by the gods themselves. One of his first great destinations was ancient Egypt. There, he stood in awe before the pyramids of Giza, monuments so vast that even time seemed small beside them. While others admired their size, Herodotus asked questions. He spoke with Egyptian priests, carefully translating their words, recording their explanations of how the pyramids were built, how thousands of workers labored for decades, how ramps and systems were used, and how kings sought immortality through stone. He did not blindly believe everything he was told. Instead, Herodotus often wrote, "This is what the Egyptians say," separating story from certainty. This honesty, this willingness to admit doubt, was revolutionary. From Egypt, he traveled onward into the heart of the Persian Empire, the greatest power the world had ever seen. He observed Persian customs, their respect for law, their methods of governance, and their belief that lies were the greatest of all sins. He described royal roads stretching across continents, messengers riding day and night, and kings who ruled lands so vast that no single man could truly know them. Yet he also recorded the darker truths. The cruelty of absolute power. The paranoia of kings. The betrayals that shaped wars. In Babylon, he wrote of towering walls and legendary engineering. In Scythia, he encountered nomadic warriors who lived without cities yet defeated great armies through patience and knowledge of the land. In Arabia, he described strange customs and dangerous trade routes. In Libya, Ethiopia, and even distant India, he collected tales, some factual, some mythical, but all revealing how people understood their world. What made Herodotus unique was not perfection, but perspective. He did not write to glorify one nation over another. He wrote to explain why humans behave as they do. To him, history was not just a record of kings and battles, it was a study of human nature. Eventually, Herodotus returned to Greece and began assembling his lifetime of observations into a single work, the Histories. It was unlike anything written before. It spoke of love and betrayal, of ambition and fear, of divine signs and human mistakes. It explained the great wars between Greece and Persia not as simple conflicts of good versus evil, but as the result of long chains of actions and consequences. When Herodotus presented his work to the Athenian assembly, its impact was immediate. The audience was captivated. For the first time, the past felt alive, not as legend, but as lived experience. In recognition of his achievement, Herodotus was awarded 250 kilograms of gold, a fortune beyond imagination. Yet his greatest reward was something far more lasting. He became known as the father of history. But before that title, before the gold, before the fame, he was simply a curious boy from Halicarnassus who believed that stories mattered. And through his stories, the ancient world still speaks. Kings who believed they were gods. As Herodotus continued his journey, one truth became impossible to ignore. The ancient world was ruled not only by armies, but by belief. Kings did not merely command, they claimed destiny. Empires did not simply expand, they believed the gods had chosen them. Nowhere was this more evident than in the lands ruled by Persia. When Herodotus entered the Persian world, he was stepping into the largest empire humanity had ever known. From the mountains of Anatolia to the rivers of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia, Persia ruled over countless peoples, languages, and religions. At the center of this vast realm stood the great king. Persian kings did not call themselves gods, but they ruled as if chosen by one. They believed order itself depended on their authority. Law, loyalty, and truth were sacred values, and rebellion was the greatest crime of all. Herodotus wrote extensively about Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. Cyrus was admired even by those he conquered. Unlike other rulers, he allowed defeated peoples to keep their customs, their religions, and their lands. To Herodotus, Cyrus represented a rare balance of power and mercy. But history, as Herodotus observed, never remains balanced for long. After Cyrus came Cambyses, his son, a king whose story darkened quickly. Cambyses invaded Egypt, defeating one of the world's oldest civilizations. But victory did not bring wisdom. According to Herodotus, Cambyses became cruel and unstable, mocking Egyptian gods, killing his own brother, and ruling through fear rather than respect. Herodotus did not shy away from these stories. He saw them as warnings. Absolute power, when mixed with arrogance, led to madness. Then came Darius, a master organizer, a king who understood that empires were not held together by swords alone. Darius divided the empire into provinces, established tax systems, built roads, and strengthened communication. Under his rule, Persia reached unprecedented efficiency. Yet even Darius could not escape ambition. His desire to punish the Greek cities that supported rebellion planted the seeds of a conflict that would echo through history, the Greco-Persian Wars. To Herodotus, these wars were not inevitable. They were the result of pride, revenge, and misunderstanding on both sides. Greeks saw Persians as tyrants, Persians saw Greeks as ungrateful rebels. Neither side truly understood the other. Herodotus believed that misunderstanding was one of history's most dangerous forces. As he recorded battles and strategies, he paid equal attention to personal stories, men torn between loyalty and fear, leaders forced to choose between mercy and control. He described generals who hesitated, messengers who changed the fate of empires, and small decisions that led to massive consequences. One such story was that of Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia. Croesus believed gold made him invincible. Before going to war, he consulted the oracle of Delphi, who told him that if he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall. Confident, Croesus marched to battle, only to realize too late that the empire to fall was his own. Herodotus loved this story because it revealed a central truth of the ancient world. Humans hear what they want to hear, even when the gods speak clearly. But history was not only shaped by kings and wars. It was also shaped by love. Herodotus recorded tales of loyalty between spouses, of women who saved cities through intelligence rather than force, and of relationships that challenged power itself. In a world dominated by men, he often paused to highlight the influence of women, queens, mothers, and advisors whose decisions changed history. One such figure was Queen Artemisia of Halicarnassus, ruler of Herodotus' homeland. Fighting alongside the Persian navy, she commanded respect even from the Persian king himself. Herodotus admired her not for blind loyalty, but for her wisdom and courage to speak truth when others remained silent. Through these stories, Herodotus revealed something revolutionary. History was not just the story of victors. It was the story of choices. Betrayal appeared again and again in his writings, cities betraying allies, generals betraying kings, friends betraying friends, yet betrayal was never simple. Often, it was born from fear, survival, or impossible dilemmas. As Herodotus moved between lands, he began to understand that no culture saw itself as cruel. Every people believed their customs were correct, their gods powerful, their enemies dangerous. And so, history became a mirror. By the time Herodotus returned to Greece, his work had grown beyond a chronicle of wars. It was a vast tapestry of human behavior, ambition and humility, wisdom and folly, love and cruelty. He was no longer just collecting stories. He was asking the most dangerous question of all. What does power do to the human soul? And in seeking that answer, Herodotus prepared the world for a new way of remembering the past, one that did not flatter kings, but tried to understand them. Yet some of the most astonishing stories were still ahead of him. Stories from lands where cities had no walls, where warriors had no kings, and where survival itself was an art. The road to Scythia, India, and the edge of the known world awaited. The edge of the known world. As Herodotus moved farther from the great palaces of kings and the stone temples of ancient cities, the world began to change. Roads disappeared. Walls vanished. And certainty faded into rumor. Beyond the borders of empires lay lands that no king truly ruled, regions shaped not by law, but by landscape. To many Greeks, these places were terrifying, chaotic, and uncivilized. To Herodotus, they were something else entirely, a test of human imagination. One of the most fascinating regions he described was Scythia. Scythia was not a kingdom. It had no capital, no palaces, and no permanent cities. Its people were nomads, living on horseback, moving with the seasons across vast grasslands. To empire builders, this way of life seemed weak. But history had proven otherwise. Scythians were nearly impossible to conquer. When powerful armies invaded their land, the Scythians simply retreated, drawing enemies deeper into empty territory. They poisoned wells, burned grasslands, and struck only when advantage was certain. Herodotus recorded how even the mighty Persian armies failed to defeat them, not because the Scythians were stronger, but because they refused to fight on the enemy's terms. To Herodotus, this was a lesson history rarely taught. Sometimes survival required wisdom, not dominance. He also described Scythian customs that shocked Greek audiences, rituals surrounding death, warfare, and identity. Yet Herodotus never mocked them. Instead, he carefully noted that what seemed strange to one culture felt natural to another. Custom, he implied, is the true king of humanity. As his journey continued eastward, stories grew stranger. In distant India, Herodotus wrote of lands rich with gold, of tribes with unfamiliar practices, and of animals unlike anything known in Greece. Some of these accounts blended fact with myth, a reflection of how information traveled in the ancient world, fragmented, exaggerated, and reshaped by each storyteller. Modern readers would later criticize Herodotus for including such tales. But Herodotus never claimed perfection. He wrote what people told him. He recorded what he saw. And when unsure, he admitted doubt. This honesty distinguished him from poets and propagandists. He was not creating legend, he was documenting belief. To Herodotus, belief itself was historical evidence. In Arabia, he described harsh deserts and trade routes guarded by danger. Frankincense and myrrh flowed through these lands, valuable not only for trade but for religious ritual. He told of customs that emphasized honor, hospitality, and survival in unforgiving conditions. In Ethiopia, he wrote of tall, long-lived people who believed themselves closer to the gods. Their king, he said, ruled not through fear, but moral authority. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories challenged Greek assumptions about civilization. The further Herodotus traveled, the clearer one truth became. No single culture held a monopoly on wisdom. Yet at the heart of his work remained the great tension between East and West, the looming conflict between Persia and Greece. Herodotus returned again and again to the question of why wars truly begin. Not because of destiny, not because of gods alone, but because of pride, revenge, and memory. He believed that human beings were trapped in cycles, one act of violence answering another, one insult demanding retribution. Empires remembered injuries for generations. Kings inherited grudges along with their crowns. Nowhere was this clearer than in the story of Xerxes, son of Darius. Xerxes inherited not only the Persian throne, but an unfinished war against Greece. Herodotus described him as powerful, emotional, and torn between ambition and doubt. Before invading Greece, Xerxes consulted advisors, priests, and omens. He ordered bridges built across the Hellespont, commanding nature itself to obey him. When a storm destroyed the bridges, Xerxes ordered the sea to be whipped as punishment. To Herodotus, this moment symbolized the greatest danger of power. The belief that nature, people, and fate itself must submit to human will. Yet Herodotus did not portray Xerxes as a monster. He described his moments of hesitation, his tears upon realizing the mortality of his vast army, and his vulnerability as a man burdened by expectation. History, Herodotus believed, was tragic because it was human. As battles approached, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, Herodotus slowed his pace. He described conversations before a war, dreams that haunted kings, and soldiers who knew they would not return home. The famous stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae was not, to Herodotus, a simple tale of heroism. It was a story of duty, sacrifice, and cultural belief. Spartans fought not because they loved death, but because they feared dishonor more. Herodotus respected this, but he also recorded Persian bravery with equal care. This balance angered some Greeks. They wanted heroes and villains. Herodotus offered understanding. By the time his journeys neared their end, Herodotus had come to see the ancient world not as a collection of nations, but as a single human story, fragmented, conflicted, yet deeply connected. Empires rose believing they would last forever. Nomads survived by refusing permanence. Kings loved, feared, doubted, and failed. And storytellers preserved what power could not. Herodotus understood that one day, even Persia and Greece would fade. Only stories would remain. And so, with ink and memory, he prepared to challenge the greatest enemy of all: time itself. War, honor, and the price of memory. When war finally arrived, it did not come like a sudden storm. It arrived slowly, through warnings ignored, pride unchallenged, and memories of old insults that refused to fade. Herodotus believed that wars were never accidents. They were built, piece by piece, long before the first spear was raised. The Persian invasion of Greece was the greatest test the ancient world had ever seen. Xerxes gathered an army so vast that, according to Herodotus, it seemed to swallow the land itself. Men from dozens of nations marched beneath Persian banners: Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, and countless others. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and yet were bound together by imperial command. Against them stood the Greek city-states, divided, suspicious of one another, and vastly outnumbered. Herodotus focused not only on strategy, but on choice. Many Greek cities faced an impossible decision: submit to Persia and survive, or resist and risk annihilation. Some chose safety. Others chose honor. History would remember both, but not kindly. At Thermopylae, A narrow mountain pass became the stage for one of the most enduring stories of sacrifice. King Leonidas of Sparta led a small force, knowing they could not win. Herodotus recorded their calm acceptance of death, not as madness, but as obedience to law and tradition. Yet even in this moment of heroism, betrayal played its role. A local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, allowing them to surround the defenders. Herodotus did not describe Ephialtes as pure evil. Instead, he noted fear, ambition, and the hope of reward, common motives that history repeats endlessly. Betrayal, Herodotus suggested, was rarely committed by monsters. It was committed by ordinary people under pressure. After Thermopylae, the war shifted to the sea. At Salamis, Greek survival depended not on numbers, but intelligence. Herodotus told of deception, false messages, and careful manipulation of enemy expectations. Smaller Greek ships lured the massive Persian fleet into narrow waters where size became a disadvantage. The result was chaos. Oars collided. Ships burned. Men drowned beneath the weight of armor. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore as his fleet collapsed before his eyes. Herodotus recorded this moment not with triumph, but tragedy. For every victory, there was suffering. For every defeated enemy, a grieving family. As the war dragged on, alliances shifted. Old rivals became allies. Former allies betrayed one another. Herodotus noted how fear could unite enemies, and how success could tear unity apart just as quickly. The final land battle at Plataea ended Persian ambitions in Greece. The empire retreated, wounded but not destroyed. Greece survived, but at a cost. Cities lay in ruins. Populations were displaced. And unity faded as soon as the common enemy was gone. Herodotus did not celebrate endlessly. Instead, he asked what victory truly meant. Had Greece preserved freedom? Or had it merely delayed future conflict? He observed that after the war, Greek city-states quickly returned to rivalry, suspicion, and ambition. Athens arose in power. Sparta grew uneasy. The seeds of future wars were already being planted. History, Herodotus understood, never truly ends. It only changes shape. As he assembled his writings, Herodotus reflected deeply on memory itself. Why did humans remember some events and forget others? Why were certain heroes immortalized while countless lives vanished without record? His answer was simple and haunting. History remembers power unless someone chooses to remember people. Herodotus chose people. He preserved the names of messengers who ran until they collapsed, of women who defied kings, of soldiers who hesitated at crucial moments. He believed that even the smallest decision could ripple across generations. And yet, he was not blind to his own limitations. He admitted uncertainty. He presented multiple versions of events. He allowed readers to judge. This humility made his work eternal. By the time the Histories was complete, Herodotus had achieved something no conqueror ever could. He had unified the ancient world, not under a flag, but under memory. Empires fell. Cities burned. Kings died. But their stories endured. And through them, Herodotus issued a quiet warning to the future. Power fades. Wealth disappears. Only actions, remembered or forgotten, define humanity. Yet even this was not the end of his reflection. For beyond war and empire lay the most powerful forces of all: love, lost, and the private lives hidden beneath public history. Love, lost, and the human heart. Herodotus understood something that many rulers never did. Empires are built by power, but they are remembered through people. Behind every battle he recorded, behind every king he described, there existed countless lives shaped not by ambition, but by love, fear, loyalty, and loss. These were the quiet forces that truly moved history, even when history refused to name them. As Herodotus traveled, he paid careful attention to stories others dismissed as unimportant. Stories of families divided by war, of lovers separated by borders, of parents forced to choose between children and survival. In Persia, he wrote of royal households where marriage was not a matter of affection, but strategy. Kings married to secure alliances. Queens lived surrounded by luxury, yet trapped by expectation. Love existed, but it was dangerous. Herodotus described how jealousy inside royal families led to executions, betrayals, and political chaos. A single accusation whispered in a palace corridor could destroy generations. To him, these stories revealed a harsh truth. Power magnifies emotion. Love becomes obsession. Fear becomes cruelty. Loyalty becomes a test with deadly consequences. In Greece, love took different forms, but it was no less powerful. Herodotus recorded tales of devotion between husbands and wives, of friendships stronger than fear, and of citizens who chose death rather than betray those they loved. In times of war, love did not disappear, it sharpened. Men fought harder knowing their families waited behind city walls. Women endured siege and hunger to preserve homes that might never be rebuilt. Children grew up learning that survival itself was an act of courage. One of the most striking patterns Herodotus observed was the role of women in moments of crisis. Though excluded from politics and warfare, women often became the last defense of cities, protecting traditions, preserving families, and sometimes shaping decisions from the shadows. Queens advised kings. Mothers influenced generals. Wives preserved secrets that determined outcomes. Herodotus did not ignore them. He named them. He remembered them. In doing so, he challenged the idea that history belonged only to men with weapons. Lost, too, was everywhere. Herodotus wrote of soldiers who returned home only to find their families gone, of cities that survived war but lost their identity, of victors who lived long enough to envy the dead. He believed loss was the true cost of history, the price paid long after triumph faded. In Egypt, he saw a culture that understood this deeply. Egyptian belief centered on memory, afterlife, and the preservation of the soul. To forget the dead was considered a second death. Herodotus admired this devotion to remembrance. It aligned perfectly with his own purpose. To remember was to resist oblivion. As he grew older, Herodotus became increasingly aware of time's cruelty. Stories he had heard as a young traveler were already changing. Details faded. Names disappeared. Truth blurred into legend. This frightened him more than war. If stories vanished, humanity would repeat the same mistakes, again and again, believing them new. And so he wrote not only to record, but to warn. He warned that love could inspire greatness, but also blind judgment. That loyalty could build nations, but also justify atrocities. That loss, if ignored, could turn grief into vengeance. Herodotus never claimed that history could make humans wiser. But he believed it could make them aware. Aware of patterns. Aware of consequences. Aware of themselves. Toward the end of his life, as the histories spread across the Greek world, Herodotus became a figure of quiet authority. People listened when he spoke, not because he commanded, but because he understood. He had seen the ancient world from its edges to its center. He had spoken with priests, kings, soldiers, merchants, and nomads. He had watched empires rise, and begin to crack. And through it all, one truth remained constant. Human nature did not change. The names of cities would fade. The borders of empires would shift. But love, betrayal, ambition, fear, and hope would endure. Herodotus did not believe history belonged to the past. He believed it belonged to anyone willing to listen. And perhaps that was his greatest legacy, not the facts he preserved, but the humility he practiced. He reminded future generations that certainty is dangerous, that power is temporary, and that stories deserve care. For in stories, humanity recognizes itself. Yet even after all he had seen, Herodotus knew his work was incomplete. Because the greatest question still remained. If humans never change, can history ever teach us to change our future? That question would echo far beyond his lifetime, into every age that followed. The weight of memory and the birth of history. As the years passed, Herodotus was no longer the young traveler walking dusty roads with endless questions. The world he had explored was still vast, still complex, but he had begun to see it with different eyes. Not as a visitor, but as a witness. He had seen empires at their height and at their breaking point. He had spoken to men who believed history favored them, and later watched their names fade into silence. This awareness gave Herodotus a quiet seriousness. He understood that memory itself was fragile, and fragile things required care. In his later years, Herodotus spent much of his time refining the histories. He revisited stories, reconsidered versions, and added context. Unlike rulers who demanded certainty, Herodotus embraced uncertainty. When accounts conflicted, he preserved them both. To some, this made him unreliable. To others, it made him revolutionary. Because Herodotus was not trying to control the past. He was trying to understand it. As his work circulated, criticism followed. Some accused him of including myths. Others mocked his fascination with foreign customs. Later writers would even call him the father of lies. Herodotus accepted this risk. He believed that excluding stories was more dangerous than recording imperfect ones. For him, even myths revealed truth, not factual truth, but emotional truth. They showed what people feared, hoped for, and believed. And belief, Herodotus knew, shaped action. He also understood that history written only by the powerful would always serve power. So he deliberately widened his lens. He wrote about Persians with respect, even when Greeks expected hatred. He described barbarians as human beings with values, families, and honor. This was deeply unsettling to many. In a world defined by us versus them, Herodotus refused to simplify. As he aged, Herodotus spent time in Athens, the intellectual heart of Greece. Philosophers debated truth. Politicians argued about democracy and empire. Artists celebrated victory and identity. Herodotus stood slightly apart from them all. He admired Athenian freedom, but he also recognized its fragility. He sensed that Athens, like Persia before it, was beginning to believe in its own permanence. And that belief, he knew, was always dangerous. History had taught him one lesson above all others. No power believes it will fall. In quiet moments, Herodotus reflected on his own life. He had never ruled a city. He had never commanded an army. Yet his words traveled further than soldiers ever could. This realization humbled him. He did not see himself as immortal. He saw himself as temporary, just another voice passing through time. But if that voice could carry the memories of others, then perhaps it mattered. Herodotus likely spent his final years in Thrace, a Greek colony in southern Italy, where scholars and settlers attempted to build a new kind of society. It was a fitting place for a man who believed cultures could learn from one another. There, away from courts and assemblies, he continued to write, revise, and reflect. When Herodotus died, sometime in the late 5th century BC, there were no monuments built in his honor. No empire mourned him. No army saluted. And yet, something extraordinary happened. His work survived. Generations later, when cities fell and libraries burned, copies of the histories were preserved. Scholars argued with him, historians challenged him. But none could ignore him. Because he had done something no one before him had done so completely. He had made history a human story. He did not write merely to praise the victorious or condemn the defeated. He wrote to show how choices accumulate, how pride invites downfall, how fear fuels cruelty, and how understanding might prevent repetition. Through Herodotus, future generations learn not only about ancient kings and wars, but about themselves. They saw how easily certainty becomes arrogance, how quickly power blinds judgment, how often humans mistake success for destiny. And they saw, too, that curiosity could be an act of courage. Herodotus never claimed to possess final truth. Instead, he offered something far more valuable, a method. Listen widely. Question deeply. Record honestly. And accept doubt. This method became the foundation of history itself. Centuries later, historians would adopt stricter standards, demand evidence, and refine methodology. But the spirit of history, the belief that the past matters and must be examined, began with Herodotus. He was not perfect, but he was first. And sometimes, being first is enough to change the world. Yet even as his legacy grew, the ancient world he described continued its endless cycle. New empires arose. New wars erupted. New betrayals unfolded. Humanity repeated itself, just as Herodotus had warned. Which brings us to the final question his life leaves behind. If we have history, and if history remembers our mistakes, why do we continue to repeat them? That question does not belong to Herodotus alone. It belongs to everyone who reads him. Lessons written in time. Herodotus never believed that history existed to comfort humanity. He believed it existed to warn it. Looking back across the ancient world he had documented, a pattern emerged so clear that it could no longer be ignored. Every empire, no matter how powerful, believed itself different. Every king, no matter how wise, believed himself protected from the mistakes of those who came before. And every one of them was wrong. The ancient world was filled with ruins that once claimed eternity, cities that believed their walls were unbreakable, dynasties that believed their bloodline was chosen by the gods. Herodotus walked among their remains and understood what they could not. Time defeats everything. He saw how hubris, the dangerous belief in one's own invincibility, appeared again and again. Persian kings whipped the sea. Greek cities believed freedom made them immune to tyranny. Victors assumed morality belonged to them alone. History punished all of them equally. To Herodotus, the lesson was not that power was evil, but that unchecked power was blind. When rulers stopped listening, stopped questioning, stopped remembering the past, collapse became inevitable. But kings were not the only ones at fault. Herodotus also wrote for ordinary people. He saw how crowds cheered wars they would later mourn, how citizens demanded strength but feared sacrifice, how societies traded caution for pride when success came too easily. He understood that history was not shaped by leaders alone, it was shaped by collective belief. One of his most radical ideas was that no culture was superior by nature. Each believed itself best because it was familiar. Greeks mocked foreigners. Foreigners mocked Greeks. Each saw the other as foolish, cruel, or backward. Herodotus refused to choose sides. Instead, he asked readers to observe themselves. Why do we fear what is different? Why do we glorify our victories and erase our crimes? Why do we believe our age is the final one? These questions made histories uncomfortable. But discomfort, Herodotus believed, was the beginning of wisdom. As centuries passed, his work traveled far beyond the world he knew. Roman historians read him. Medieval scholars copied him. Modern historians argued with him. And yet, his voice remained present, quiet, patient, observant. He never shouted conclusions. He invited reflection. Herodotus knew that humans preferred simple stories, heroes and villains, right and wrong, victory and defeat. But reality resisted such clarity. History was complex because humans were complex. And complexity required humility. Perhaps his greatest lesson was this: understanding is stronger than dominance. Empires could conquer land, but they could not conquer memory. Only stories could cross centuries intact. Only ideas could outlive stone. Herodotus believed that remembering the past honestly was an act of responsibility. Forgetting, on the other hand, was an invitation to repeat disaster. Yet even with history preserved, he doubted whether humanity would change. He had seen too much. He had seen how knowledge failed to restrain ambition, how warnings were ignored, how lessons were admired but not applied. History could illuminate the path, but it could not force anyone to walk it. And so, Herodotus did not end the histories with hope or despair. He ended with awareness. Awareness that every generation believes itself unique. Awareness that power seduces even the cautious. Awareness that memory fades unless protected. The ancient world, through Herodotus' eyes, became more than a distant past. It became a mirror, reflecting every age that followed. Kings still rise. Empires still expand. Betrayal still poisons trust. Love still challenges power. Only the names change. This is why Herodotus matters. Not because he recorded every fact correctly, but because he taught humanity how to look at itself honestly. In the end, Herodotus did not ask to be believed without question. He asked something far more difficult: to be remembered with thought. And in that request lies the true beginning of history.